She never screamed, not when he struck her across the face, not when he tore her dress and pushed her against the
Where's the
wall,
gold hidden,
not
missy?
even when he whispered what he planned to do with her body when he was finished. Mary Parker, 19, orphaned at 12, employed as a housemaid in the Mason household for 3 years, simply looked Randall Mason in the eyes and said one word: no. The sound of that word hung in the air of the back room like gun smoke after a shot. Nobody said no to the sheriff's son, not in Redemption Creek, not in 1883. Randall's face changed then. The drunken lust hardened into something cold and empty. He struck her again, harder this time, and blood filled her mouth. Then he called for Jake Cooper, his loyal dog with a gun on his hip and blood on his hands. "Take her to Canyon Creek," Randall ordered, wiping Mary's blood from his knuckles. "Make it deep enough that the coyotes don't bring her back up. If you can't manage that simple task, I'll put you in the ground right beside her." Jake dragged Mary, half conscious and bleeding, to his wagon. The night was moonless, as if even the heavens turned away from what was happening. He drove for an hour, the girl lying in the back, her wrists bound with rope that cut into her flesh. Every so often, he glanced back, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. When the wagon finally stopped by a shallow creek bed, Jake climbed down, lit a cigarette, and stared at the stars. His hands trembled as he pulled Mary from the wagon. She stood on unsteady legs, her eyes unfocused but still defiant. Jake drew his Remington revolver, checked the cylinder, 6 bullets, though he'd only need 1. "Turn around," he muttered. Mary didn't move. "I said turn around, damn it. Don't make me look at your face." "If you're man enough to kill me," Mary whispered through swollen lips, "then be man enough to watch me die." Jake's hand shook. He'd killed before. 3 men in fair fights, or at least fights the saloon crowd deemed fair. But this was different. This was murder, plain and simple. The girl's steady gaze bore into him, through him, like she was already a ghost witnessing his damnation. The hammer of Jake's revolver was half-cocked when the shot rang out. Not from his gun, from somewhere in the darkness. The bullet struck with surgical precision, shattering the Remington in Jake's hand. He howled, dropping to his knees, clutching his bleeding fingers to his chest. "Next one goes through your skull, boy." The voice came from the shadows, deep, commanding, a voice used to being obeyed. A voice that had called men to battle and watched them die. Major Thomas Blackwood emerged from the darkness like a specter, his Spencer repeating rifle still trained on Jake's head. At 48, Blackwood stood tall and weathered, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his slouch hat. The moonlight glinted off the 1860 Army Colt holstered at his hip, the weapon of an officer who'd survived Antietam, Gettysburg, and Cold Harbor. "Get on your horse and ride," Blackwood ordered Jake. "Your life is a gift you don't deserve." Jake scrambled to his feet and fled, leaving his broken gun in the dust. Mary watched him go, then collapsed to her knees. Blackwood approached cautiously, lowering his rifle but keeping it ready. "It's all right now, miss," he said, his voice softening slightly. Mary looked up at this stranger, this man who appeared from nowhere like divine judgment. Blood trickled from her split lip, and bruises were already darkening on her face. She wavered, consciousness slipping away. "Please," she whispered, "don't judge me." Then she crumpled into the dust. Blackwood lifted her as gently as he would a wounded comrade, noting the rope burns on her wrists, the torn dress, the pattern of bruises that told a story he'd seen too many times before. In his saddlebag, he carried a medical kit, a remnant of his days as a field officer when he learned to stitch wounds under cannon fire. He carried her to his horse and rode through the night to his ranch, 20 acres of struggling land with a sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands after the war. It was a place of solitude, of exile, where he'd buried himself after burying his wife and infant son, victims of the fever that swept through Denver in '76. By dawn, he'd cleaned Mary's wounds, stitched a deep gash on her forehead using whiskey as antiseptic and catgut thread, and wrapped her in the only clean blanket he owned. As he worked, he noticed a cloth band that had fallen from her pocket, embroidered with the name Mason Ranch. Blackwood froze, recognition dawning like a cold sunrise. Mason, Sheriff Jeremiah Mason. The name hit him like a physical blow. In his mind, he was suddenly back at Antietam, September 1862. Captain Jeremiah Mason of the Confederate Cavalry, charging across the cornfield. Mason's saber flashing in the sun as it cut down Lieutenant David Coleman, Blackwood's closest friend since boyhood. The look in Mason's eyes as he and Blackwood locked gazes across the smoke-filled field. No remorse, no humanity, just the cold emptiness of a man who enjoyed killing. After the war, when Blackwood learned Mason had become sheriff in Redemption Creek, he'd deliberately chosen this land, far from town. He'd avoided the man for 8 years. Now fate had dropped Mason's business, his evil, right at Blackwood's door. "What have you gotten yourself into, old man?" he muttered to himself, watching Mary's labored breathing. By midday, word was spreading through Redemption Creek. Jake Cooper had returned, his hand bandaged, his story changing with each telling. By sunset, Sheriff Mason knew his son's intended victim was alive, and worse, she was with Thomas Blackwood, a ghost from his past he'd hoped never to see again. Randall Mason slammed his fist on his father's desk. At 28, he was the spitting image of his father in his prime. Tall, broad-shouldered, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. "I want her dead," he growled. "Her and that Union bastard both." Sheriff Mason loaded his Colt Peacemaker with deliberate calm. Major Blackwood was the best shot in the Northern Army, boy. He once took out a Confederate colonel at 800 yards at Second Bull Run. He snapped the cylinder shut. "We do this my way." Back at the ranch, Blackwood was preparing for war. He'd survived 22 battles and 3 assassination attempts. He knew how to fortify a position. By nightfall, he'd rigged an early warning system of tripwires connected to tin cans around the property perimeter. He'd positioned his rifle at the upstairs window with clear sight lines to all approaches. He'd filled canteens, loaded spare ammunition, and placed weapons at strategic points throughout the house. Mary woke as he was checking the action on a shotgun. She startled, eyes wide with fear, until recognition dawned. "You saved me," she said, her voice hoarse. "Rest easy," Blackwood replied. "You're safe here." "No," she shook her head weakly. "Nobody's safe from the Masons. Not in this county. I've faced worse than some frontier tyrant and his spoiled son," Blackwood said, though he knew Mason was more dangerous than most. A man who'd retained his taste for violence after Antietam was a special kind of monster. Mary told him everything, how Randall had been watching her for months, how he'd cornered other girls before, how his father buried any complaints, how the entire town lived in fear of crossing the Mason family. "They'll come for us," she said. Blackwood nodded. "I'm counting on it." Just before midnight, the warning system jangled. Someone was approaching from the east. Blackwood positioned himself at the window, rifle ready, then relaxed slightly when he saw it was a lone rider. Jake Cooper, coming slowly, his hands visible. "Stay inside," Blackwood told Mary, taking his Colt as he went to the porch. Jake dismounted at a distance, leaving his gun belt draped over the saddle horn. He approached with his hands raised. "I didn't come to fight," he called out. "Speak your piece," Blackwood answered, gun trained steady. "I couldn't do it," Jake said, his voice breaking. "Couldn't kill her. Been riding with Randall 3 years. Done things I ain't proud of. But murder a girl? I draw the line." "Mason send you to finish the job?" Jake shook his head. "Mason don't know I'm here. He'd kill me if he did. I came to warn you. They're coming at dawn, 6 men. Randall's bringing dynamite from the mining camp. Blackwood studied the younger man. Jake was perhaps 25, with the haunted eyes of someone who'd seen too much, too young. Blackwood recognized the look. He'd seen it in the mirror after Gettysburg. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm tired," Jake said simply. "Tired of being what they made me." Blackwood considered for a long moment, then nodded toward the house. "Get inside, but know this. You make one wrong move, and I'll put a bullet in you before you can blink." As dawn approached, Blackwood rode into town, leaving Jake to guard Mary. He headed for a small cabin at the edge of town, where Samuel Washington, a free black man who'd served as a scout in Blackwood's unit during the war, operated an unofficial saloon for those unwelcome at the town's main establishment. Samuel, now 63 with a shock of white hair and arms still strong from his blacksmithing days, wasn't surprised to see his former commanding officer. "Figured you'd show up sooner or later," he said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "Word is you've crossed the Masons." "The Masons crossed me," Blackwood corrected, then explained the situation. Samuel nodded grimly. "That girl ain't the first." Mason's boy put his hands on Emily Carter, blacksmith's daughter, last spring. When her father complained, he had an accident at the forge, lost 3 fingers. "How many men are loyal to Mason?" Blackwood asked. 5, maybe 6 who'd kill for him," Samuel replied. "Most folks just keep their heads down." They spent an hour mapping the town, planning escape routes, identifying potential allies. When Blackwood rose to leave, Samuel retrieved a Spencer rifle similar to Blackwood's own from a hidden compartment under the floorboards. "Still remember how to use this?" Blackwood asked. Samuel's teeth flashed white against his dark skin. "Some things a man don't forget, Major." Blackwood returned to find his ranch undisturbed, but the peace wouldn't last. Just after sunset, the attack came, not from the road as expected, but across the open pasture to the west. 5 riders spread in a skirmish line, approaching fast. The tripwire alarm jangled. Blackwood positioned himself at the upstairs window, Mary and Jake below with loaded weapons. The first shot came from Randall, wild and high. Blackwood held his fire, calculating, watching. At 80 yards, he squeezed the trigger. One of the riders fell. At 70 yards, he fired again. Another down. The remaining 3 split up. One headed for the barn while 2 circled toward the house. Blackwood calmly reloaded, sighted, and dropped the man near the barn with a clean shot through the chest. Downstairs, glass shattered as someone tried to enter through a window. Jake fired the shotgun, and a scream told them the shot found its mark. The last rider, Randall, retreated toward the tree line, firing wildly behind him. In the sudden silence, Blackwood moved through the house, checking for injuries. Jake was unharmed. Mary stood shaking in the kitchen, shotgun still clutched in white-knuckled hands, but she too was uninjured. "They'll be back," Blackwood said, "with more men." "So we run?" Jake asked. Blackwood shook his head. "Running just postpones the inevitable. Tomorrow we take the fight to them." At dawn, Samuel arrived with news. The entire town was on edge. Mason had deputized 10 men. They were planning to burn Blackwood's ranch to the ground, with orders to bring Mary and Jake back alive for public hanging. "We need leverage," Blackwood said, thinking aloud. "Something to turn the town against Mason." Samuel's expression changed. "There might be something. During the war, Mason wasn't just a Confederate officer. He was a raider, Quantrill's men. They robbed banks, killed civilians. I heard Mason kept journals. Supposedly, he's got records of everything hidden in his office." It was a slim chance, but it was all they had. That night, Blackwood and Jake crept into town while Samuel and Mary created a diversion at the saloon. Using skills honed during wartime intelligence missions, Blackwood picked the lock on the sheriff's office and slipped inside. The safe behind Mason's desk yielded nothing, but a loose floorboard beneath the gun cabinet revealed a hidden compartment. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting detailing 2 decades of crimes, bank robberies, murders, bribes, and the names of accomplices, some now prominent citizens. Most damning were the entries about Randall, detailing the sheriff's systematic cover-up of his son's escalating violence against women. Blackwood had just secured the journal in his coat when a floorboard creaked in the hallway. He and Jake barely escaped through the window, scrambling across the roof as bullets splintered the shingles behind them. By morning, they had a plan. It wasn't a good plan. It bordered on suicide, but it was the only one with a chance of success. At high noon, when the town square was busiest, 4 riders approached from the North Road. Blackwood led, tall in the saddle, his Union Army coat brushed clean, his Spencer rifle across his lap. Jake rode beside him, shotgun ready. Behind them came Samuel, dignified and resolute, and Mary, her face still bruised but her back straight, her eyes clear. They halted in the center of town. People stopped to stare. Conversations died. A child was hurriedly pulled indoors. Sheriff Mason emerged from his office, Randall at his side. 6 deputies flanked them, hands hovering over holstered guns. "Thomas Blackwood," Mason called, his voice carrying across the silent street. "You're a wanted man. Trespassing, kidnapping, attempted murder." "Jeremiah Mason," Blackwood replied, his voice equally strong. "Murderer at Antietam, raider with Quantrill, and now a disgrace to the badge you wear." He held up the journal for all to see. "I have here the record of your crimes, bank robberies in Missouri, murders in Kansas, and most recently, your conspiracy to cover up your son's attacks on the women of this town." Murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. Mason's face darkened. "Lies," he spat, "from a desperate man." "Tell that to Emily Carter," Blackwood responded. "Tell it to Sarah Williams and Rebecca Foster. Tell it to Mary Parker here, who your son tried to have killed for refusing his advances." The blacksmith pushed through the crowd, his maimed hand visible, his daughter Emily at his side. Their presence seemed to embolden others. More women stepped forward, each bearing the invisible scars of Randall's cruelty, each finding courage in Mary's defiant stance. "Enough of this," Randall snarled, drawing his gun. "Pa, let's end this now." What happened next would be recounted in Redemption Creek for generations. Randall fired first, aiming at Mary. Jake threw himself in front of her, taking the bullet in his shoulder. Samuel shot one deputy, who raised his weapon. Blackwood's Spencer barked twice, disarming 2 more. Sheriff Mason drew with the practiced speed that had made him feared during the war. His first shot grazed Blackwood's side. His second missed as Blackwood rolled from the saddle, returning fire from behind a water trough. Gunsmoke filled the street as the battle erupted in earnest. Townspeople scattered, seeking shelter in doorways and behind wagons. Some, like the blacksmith, grabbed weapons and joined the fight against the Masons. Randall, seeing the tide turning, made a desperate dash for Mary, determined to take her with him if he couldn't have his revenge. Jake, bleeding but conscious, tripped him as he passed. They grappled in the dust until Randall's hand found his knife. The blade flashed once, twice, opening red lines across Jake's chest. Mary grabbed a fallen deputy's gun. Having never fired a weapon before, she hesitated for a crucial second, then pulled the trigger. The bullet caught Randall in the back. He arched, frozen in surprise, then collapsed across Jake's body. Across the street, Blackwood and Mason faced each other directly for the first time in 21 years. Recognition flashed between them. The cornfield at Antietam, smoke and blood and death. "You should have stayed dead, Blackwood," Mason growled. "Some ghosts don't rest easy, Mason," Blackwood replied. Their shots came simultaneously. Mason's bullet tore through Blackwood's left shoulder. Blackwood's shot hit Mason in the chest, just below the sheriff's badge. Mason staggered, disbelief in his eyes. He tried to raise his gun again, but his strength was failing. He fell to his knees, then toppled face first into the dirt of the town he'd terrorized for years. The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Then slowly, one by one, the surviving deputies dropped their weapons. Aftermath came swiftly. Jake survived his wounds, thanks to Blackwood's battlefield medical skills. Mary, finding her voice at last, told her story to the circuit judge who arrived 3 days later. The judge appointed Samuel as temporary sheriff until elections could be held, the first black man to wear a badge in the territory. Blackwood's wound healed slowly. As he recovered, he found himself drawn back to life in a way he hadn't been since losing his family. The ranch, once a place of exile, became a gathering point. Samuel brought news from town. Mary, now working at Samuel's newly legitimate saloon, visited regularly. Jake, healing in both body and spirit, began helping with the ranch work, learning honest labor for the first time in his life. One evening, as autumn painted the distant mountains gold and crimson, Blackwood stood on his porch, watching the sunset. The solitude that had once been his only comfort now felt hollow. He had found something he thought lost forever in the blood-soaked fields of Virginia: purpose, connection, perhaps even redemption. "Coffee, Major?" Mary appeared at his side, offering a steaming cup. "Thomas," he corrected gently, "war's been over a long time." "Some battles never end," she said, her eyes knowing beyond her years. "But it helps to have allies." He nodded, accepting both the coffee and the wisdom. In the distance, a rider appeared on the horizon, a stranger, too far to identify. Blackwood's hand instinctively moved toward his gun. "Trouble?" Mary asked. "Always is," he replied, but without bitterness. Whatever came, he would face it standing. The rider drew closer, and Blackwood saw he carried something. A poster, perhaps. Another bounty, another challenge, another fight waiting to happen. But for the first time in years, Thomas Blackwood wasn't facing the world alone. Sometimes justice comes from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it comes from the courage to stand against evil. And sometimes, most rarely of all, it comes from finding family in the broken souls who've weathered the same storms and lived to see the clearing skies.